Stalker. A short horror story. Christopher struggled to hang onto his cup as his body trembled in fear. The black liquid in the mug splashed and sloshed over the rim onto his pale hands, but the burning sensation eluded him. There were more pressing matters on his mind. He had seen her again just like the last 4 nights. She crept around the corners of his small apartment. Her movements fell only upon the ears of the dead. He could feel her bright bulging eyes peering at him from the darkness as her jaw hung agape with hunger. She craved his taste as she left trails of gray-hued drool across his floors. The cracks and snaps of her bones filled his mind as she stalked him on all fours. Thankfully, this little game of hers only occurred once the day had gone and the night took its place. He kept his knees pressed together and his arms tucked into his sides as he sat at the kitchen table. He positioned himself so that the only thing that would be behind him was the fridge. He could see the rest of the kitchen from this angle and most of the living room adjacent to him. If she was here tonight, he would spot her and know that it wasn't just his mind decaying under the stress. He raised the cup to his lips, effectively spilled most of the contents onto the table before he sipped the hot liquid. He had to stay awake. He had to keep himself from drifting to sleep or else she would follow him. He took another messy sip. This time he spilled the beverage onto his already sweat-soaked shirt. Still, the burning pain did not faze Christopher. He just kept gazing past the white linoleum floor into the carpeted living room. His mind went wild. Like a child imagining monsters within the shadows of the night, he swore he saw something move just behind the far armrest of the couch. He stared in that direction for a few moments until his eyes shot around to the rest of his surroundings in fear that she was elsewhere. He saw nothing, but he felt her presence. Her massive eyes, that nearly popped from her skull, peering at him from a darker place. He took another sip of the coffee and kept watching. 4 days ago, Christopher had come home in a foul mood. Work had not gone the way he would have wanted it and more stress was placed upon his head. He closed the door behind him and dropped his bag to the floor before kicking off his shoes. He then tore his coat away and hung it on the hook by the door. Now, in the comfort of his box, he let out a hefty groan and ran his fingers through his short, blondish brown hair. He scratched at his cranium as his fingers went along in an attempt to release the burden from his skull. It helped slightly, but it wasn't enough to cool the fire. He had wished he heard the sound of the TV playing or the gentle sound of pages rubbing together as they turned. These noises would have meant that his girlfriend was home. Her presence alone would be more than enough to calm him. To hear her voice would effectively quench the fire. However, he remembered quickly that she was away visiting family out of town and that she wouldn't be back for the rest of the week. With that realization, Christopher sighed and went to the kitchen to make himself something to eat. His apartment was a bit messier now since his girlfriend was absent. The sink was beginning to pile up with dishes and he was getting behind on his weekly laundry. Dirty clothes seemed to creep from his bedroom just off the living room. He opened the fridge and bent down to see the contents he could scrounge into a meal. There wasn't much. Just a couple of jars of condiments, some overly processed lunch meat, and a bag of cheese curds that was already 3/4 gone even though he bought the bag yesterday. No matter. What was left was enough for him. He grabbed the meat, curds, and barbecue sauce and made a note to go grocery shopping tomorrow after work. He then began preparing a meal that would be fit for a college frat house king. He laid the strips of meat out on the last clean plate and rolled a cheese curd up in each one. He popped the plate full of 6 cheese rolls into the microwave and set the timer to 40 seconds. Crack! Snap! Click! Christopher only stared through the window of the microwave at his soon-to-be meal. Click! Crunch! Pop! He suddenly spun around as he realized the noise was not coming from the heating meal but from behind him. His eyes were wide and his heart raced as the adrenaline pumped through his body. He saw nothing. Just the slightly messy apartment still as it was. The noise didn't come again, but a needle of paranoia set in the back of his head. He stared for a moment longer until the high-pitched beeping of the appliance, signaling that his meal was ready, startled him as well. He took a breath to settle his nerves and shook his head with a slight smile. I'm finally losing it. He fetched his dinner and plopped down on the couch to watch some TV. Then when he grew tired, he turned in for the night. The moments just before he drifted to sleep were what he dreaded the most. There was no one there to be with him, no one to stare into their eyes before they kissed goodnight. Christopher's alarm woke him with its horrible jingle of bells. He threw the blankets off him and rose to get ready for work. He pulled on a pair of jeans and a gray hoodie with the word Air Force written on the chest that his father used to wear. He then did his routine in the bathroom as everyone did before heading to their place of employment. However, he didn't take the time to make breakfast since there wasn't anything to constitute a meal now. Plus, he was running a tad late and decided to pick something up at a gas station on his way. He picked up his bag and reached for the door handle, but he stopped short. A chill ran up his spine as an eerie sensation came to him. His body felt strange and the back of his head felt hot. It resembled a feeling he got when someone was staring at him without his knowledge. A sense he was accustomed to when he visited a bar late at night and some girl was taking a liking to him. Christopher turned his head back to his apartment. He didn't know why he did, since he knew he was the only one there. He saw nothing behind him and the rest of his home remained empty. So, he left and continued with his day. Several hours passed until the noise of a lock being turned came from the other side of the door. Christopher was home again. He closed the door behind him and again dropped the bag from his shoulder. The plummeting pack made a heavy thud as it collided against the wood-floored entryway. The young man was in the same mood as before. Stressed, irritated, miserable. Again, he wished he heard the soft footsteps of his companion making her way to greet him, but the sound and her voice never came. He reached his arms up for a quick stretch. Hopefully, the stress would fall from his spine. Then, he made a straight path to the kitchen. He swung the refrigerator door open and peered inside. Shoot, he had forgotten to make a stop at the grocery store. The same bottles of condiments gazed back at him and wished for some friends in this icebox. Christopher shut the fridge and stood up to open the upper freezer compartment in hopes that there was something in there. Crack! Christopher spun on his heels. He stared past the archway to the kitchen and into the living room. The awful noise made his ears ring. It sounded like a tree's trunk had snapped clean in half. Just like yesterday, his eyes saw nothing. However, the chill in his spine had come back. He blinked rapidly. Maybe his sudden imagination was playing tricks on him, or he did see the gleam of two massive eyes gazing back at him from around the corner of the archway. He stared for a few moments more until he rationalized himself back down to earth. However, even though he was settled, he didn't turn his back to the other room again. He only took glances at the freezer next to him. In the quick flashes, he saw a frosty bag of chicken tenders. He grabbed them, haphazard poured them onto the same plate he had used last night, and shoved them into the microwave. The loud beeping commenced soon after and he ate his dinner. After he had finished, he went to watch the television like before, but this time he couldn't focus on the screen. His eyes kept drifting to his surroundings. He didn't do this on purpose, of course. Eventually, he would catch himself staring into a dark corner or just beyond his bedroom door and resume his blank observance of the constantly changing screen. Soon, his eyelids grew heavy and he retired to his bedroom to get some rest before the next day. However, as he laid his head on the pillow and pulled the blankets up to his cheek, he could still feel a stranger's gaze upon him. The annoying jingle of his phone didn't ring. Christopher had forgotten to plug in its charger, but he still woke up all the same. Crrrrk, there was another, more dreadful, sound in his room. Christopher had been up for the past half hour sitting against the headboard of his bed. His eyes are wide and his legs are tucked tight against his body. Scrrrkk, his heart pounded in his chest and the anxiety rushed through his head. His eyes shot around the room and focused in the direction where the noise came from. It changed every time it came. Like someone was moving around the bed. Not someone, something. Crunch. This one was far more sudden and much louder. The young man flinched and awaited what was to come. However, he was still left alone in his bed, all curled up and trembling with terror. Silence fell around him. The only thing he could hear was the blood pumping through his head and the stuttery breaths he pulled in and blew out. It was watching him. He could feel the eyes upon him again, and they stared straight into his. They were unshifting and filled with hunger. A hot wind washed over his face. A sudden breath that reeked of decayed flesh and blood. Christopher shot up from the bed and bolted to the door. He had to get out of here. Snap. Crunch. Crack. Click. It was after him. He let out a shriek as he felt the breath on the backs of his ankles. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open before fleeing into the hall. He ran for another moment until he realized that the noises had ceased and that he was out in the open in just a pair of boxers. He turned back and gazed down the hallway towards the open door. There it was. The massive eyes that stared at him from the darkness. The thin, blue irises surrounding the pinhole pupils that gazed into his. Her mouth was gaping wide into a deep black hole with thick strings of gray drool hanging off her rotting tongue. Her skin was pale and her stringy damp hair hung in front of her face. She was gone. Skittering back to whatever dark place she had made her home in the apartment. How could he tell them? They'd think he was crazy. They might even ridicule him for his wild claims. He couldn't go back, at least, not alone after what he had seen. It was late when Christopher came back to his apartment. After borrowing some clothes from his father, he went out for the day with his closest friends. They fished for most of the time. Then, when the fish refused to bite and the sun was getting low, they packed up their gear and went to the college hotspot. The line of rich drink helped Christopher take his mind off of what happened earlier. The company of his fellow inebriated companions made him forget the entire thing. They piled through the door of his apartment and stumbled through the living room to pick a place to collapse. One of them fell face first into the couch and snoring commenced soon after. Another did the same as he crawled into the corner after he had found a nice comfy blanket. However, the third and last friend was still wide awake and spry for the events of the night. "I'm gonna kick your ass," Brett exclaimed as he struggled to stay on his own 2 feet. Christopher didn't feel like wrestling the scrawny man, but he knew he couldn't calm Brett down unless he pinned him. Brett stumbled around and eyed Christopher. His stare alone was a challenge that Christopher couldn't refuse. Suddenly the other man lunged and wrapped his arms around Christopher's waist. It was an attempt to tackle the larger and stronger man to the ground. However, Brett wasn't known for his strength. So, Christopher simply fell upon the poor twig, effectively squishing the other beneath his average weight. Brett wheezed and yelled slurs along with a mixture of poorly crafted insults. Christopher only smiled through the onslaught of drunken babble and stayed firmly on top of his friend. This is how it always went when Brett wished to challenge the much stronger man. Yet, every night they went drinking, he would challenge Christopher. Eventually, like always, Brett's insults turned to pleading. His air ran out and his body probably began to ache. So, Christopher rolled off his friend and sat back against the couch. Brett slowly rose onto his hands and knees as he coughed up his dignity, but Christopher knew it wasn't over. After Brett had caught his breath, he would lunge again and fail again. Brett groaned as he sat back on his calves facing Christopher. He mumbled more insults while he gathered what little strength he had. Christopher watched and prepared himself for the other to make the first move. While he did, he saw something. His eyes shifted to the right of Brett's head and he squinted to see through the fog of inebriation that clouded his vision. She was right there, staring back at him just through the messy strands of Brett's hair. How could he not feel her? How could he not notice her boiling breaths on the back of his neck or smell the stench from her mouth? She was right there. Brett had lunged once again. He pushed Christopher to the floor and moved on top of him. Christopher stared to where she was, but she no longer remained. "How's it feel, fucker?" Brett exclaimed with triumph in his voice while Christopher was not concerned with the victory at this point. Needless to say, he didn't sleep alone that night. He didn't sleep at all. Brett, Will, and Sam stayed for a few hours in the morning until their hangovers had faded. Then they all went back to their places to catch up on the sleep they had missed. None of them caught on to Christopher's distress. They failed to notice his tense demeanor and tired eyes. Now, he was alone with it once more. His hands nearly dropped the cup of coffee as he took another sip. The rest of the liquid had spilled out as he set it back on the table. His eyes darted around at each noise he could hear. He was going crazy. It had to have just been his mind breaking under the stress. He wished his girlfriend was here. Maybe her presence would make this all go away. He glanced up at the clock hanging above the archway to the living room. 10:30. She was supposed to be back today. Hopefully, before he heard that awful noise of the creature's bones cracking under its weight, he would hear the front door click open. Crunch. No. Crack. God no. His eyes shot around the room. It was here. Snap. Where is it? His legs shook like an earthquake was occurring and his heart thumped like a hammer bashing into his ribcage. Suddenly, he felt the breath. That hot breath brought the stench of flesh with it. He felt it on his stomach. He was frozen. His mind turned numb at the realization of where it was. Perhaps, where it had been the entire time. He leaned back against the chair. A part of him hoped that he was just imagining it. He prayed that he was just going insane. There she was. Tucked beneath the table waiting to meet the gaze of its next meal. Demon Stalker? Skinwalker? My family owns a vacation home in a very small town. The population is about 100, in Maine. It's the kind of town where everyone knows everyone and everyone knows everyone's business too. It's only about 2.5 hours away from our actual house, so we go there for literally every holiday and most weekends in the summer. Our family has owned the house for decades and we are there frequently, so we know the locals well. A few days before this past Thanksgiving, 2022, we were driving to the house. I was in the car with my mom and dad, and my sister and her husband were following behind us in their car. We are about 20 minutes away from the house and I'm staring out of the window half asleep when I see what I thought was a scarecrow on the side of the road, but as we get a little closer, I see that it's an actual person. A really creepy looking person. It's a young man, maybe mid to late 20s with very pale skin with almost a grayish tint. He's very skinny with shoulder-length black hair that is stringy and greasy looking. He was wearing baggy jeans and a t-shirt that was kind of grubby looking, but what made him so creepy was the way he was standing like a scarecrow with his arms outstretched and hanging at the elbows. His head was cocked to one side and the look on his face was so scary, like a deranged clown without the makeup. He was just standing there, several feet from the road in the literal middle of nowhere, with no houses or businesses for several miles, and there was no car around that could have been his. He was so creepy looking that I said out loud, "Oh my God," to which my mom said, "What is it, sweetie?" She hadn't seen him because she was nose deep in a book. "That creepy guy on the side of the road," I said. "You mean that scarecrow?" My dad said with a chuckle. I figured he was right. It was just a realistic looking scarecrow and my eyes were just playing tricks on me because I was tired. But then my sister FaceTimed me and said, "WTF was up with that guy on the side of the road? You saw him too?" "I thought it was just a scarecrow," I answered. "No, it was a real guy." Chris slowed down to get a better look and he winked at us. Now, my sister is not the kind of person to lie or exaggerate. She is a law student who is very logical and down to earth. "Seems kinda late for Halloween pranks," said my dad. "He wasn't wearing a coat." I said. "It was about 30 degrees Fahrenheit, -1°C, he was a creep. Let's speed up and just get there." My sister sounded scared. It was rare to hear her like that. About 20 minutes later we arrived at the house, which is at the end of a privet road that is heavily wooded. It's very secluded and hard to find if you don't know exactly where you're going. My sister and I decided we wanted to go get some beers at a general store that is in the next town over, about 20 minutes away in the opposite direction from where we saw the creepy guy. As we are driving, about a mile away from the general store, we see the creepy guy walking along the side of the road. Now this was roughly 1 hour and about 35 miles away from where we first saw this guy. There is no way he could have walked that far in that short amount of time. My sister was freaked out and just wanted to go back home, but we were already here and there were several other cars parked outside, so the store was busy. For a small town general store, how did he get here so fast? "He doesn't have a car?" asked my sister. "Maybe someone gave him a ride?" I said. "Nobody in this town is going to pick up a hitchhiker, especially not one who looks like that," said my sister. I shrugged and said, "Let's get in there before he gets any closer. I don't want to be alone in the parking lot with him." We rushed inside hoping he was just passing by and wouldn't come in the store too. We went in and greeted the owner, who we know well from having gone there since we were kids, and began browsing around picking out drinks. Suddenly everything goes quiet because the owner of the store stops his conversation with another customer. It's a very small store so no conversations are private, and says loudly, "Can I help you, son?" with a very suspicious tone to his voice. My sister and I looked at each other, knowing that the creepy guy had just walked in. I peeked around the corner of the aisle I was in and saw him, just standing there at the entrance of the store, no expression on his face. He ignored the owner and just stared off into space, not moving away from the entrance. I said, "Can I help you?" said the owner a little louder. The guy looked at him and said no, in a gruff voice, and walked out of the store. "Do you know that guy?" the owner asked me and my sister. "No, but we saw him earlier acting like a creep on the side of the road," answered my sister. My sister told the owner and the other customers in the store all about how we saw him standing like a scarecrow and how he winked at her and her husband. The owner could tell we were scared and walked us out to our car when we left, but the creepy guy was gone and we didn't see him again for another 2 days. On the third day of our stay, my sister and her husband were driving to a grocery store about an hour away to do some last-minute shopping for Thanksgiving. We had to drive past the general store, and as we did, we saw the creepy guy sitting on a wooden planter box that's in front of the general store sign by the road. As we drove past, he stood up suddenly, like he had been waiting for us. I was in the back seat and turned around to watch him out the back window. After we passed, he started running after our car, and he was running fast. Not like superhuman fast, but faster than you would expect someone who is not an Olympic athlete to be able to run. My sister was watching him from the side mirror and started freaking out, so her husband floored it and we lost him pretty quickly, but my sister was so scared she couldn't stop talking about it the whole rest of the ride to the grocery store. We got to the grocery store about 45 minutes later and did our shopping, which took us about an hour. As we were about to check out, my sister suddenly remembered she had left her reusable bags in the car and asked me if I would run out and get them. I agreed and headed out to the parking lot. I started walking towards our car, which was towards the back of the parking lot, when I saw him, standing by a telephone pole on the edge of the parking lot staring directly at me. I turned and ran back into the store and found my sister and her husband in line at the checkout. "He's out there," I gasped. "You're kidding, don't joke around like that," my sister said angrily. "I wish I was joking, but I'm not. He's out there by the telephone pole," I said, out of breath from running, and from fear. "This is ridiculous. I'm putting a stop to this here and now," said my sister's husband, and stormed out of the store acting all macho. My sister questioned me about what I saw and I told her how he was staring right at me. We talked about it for the next several minutes while we checked out, and even told the cashier about what was going on. She asked if we wanted the manager to call the police, but my sister said no, her husband was handling it. We finished checking out, and when we exited the store, my sister's husband was waiting in the car right outside the door. He jumped out, pale and looking scared, and began quickly loading the groceries in the car and told me and my sister to get in the car. My sister asked what happened and he told her to just get in the car. On the way home, he told us that when he went outside, he saw the guy, but when he started walking towards him, the guy bolted across the street and into a wooded area behind some houses. What scared him was how fast the guy ran, and the way he ran. He said that the guy galloped using his legs and arms like the werewolf in Harry Potter. My sister's husband is in the army, so he is in extremely good physical condition and even runs marathons. He said that this guy ran so fast that there was no way he could have ever tried to chase him down, and the way the guy was running freaked him out. He had never seen a person run like that before. On our way home, we stopped at the general store to get more beer because it was cheaper than the grocery store. While we were checking out, the owner told us that the creepy guy had been in earlier that day. We said that we had seen him sitting in front of the general store and then again at the grocery store an hour away. The owner of the general store told us that the creepy guy had come into his store earlier that day and walked around the store for over an hour. Now remember, this is a very small store. Most customers spend less than 10 minutes in this store unless they are having a conversation with the owner. He said that the creepy guy was just lingering in the store, not even shopping for anything. He just looked like he was waiting. The owner asked him several times if he needed help with anything, and every time he just said, "No." In the same gruff, deadpan voice. The owner said he finally told him to buy something or leave, and that's when the creepy guy went outside and sat on the planter box for another 3.5 hours until he suddenly jumped up and sprinted off at the same time we drove by. The next day was Thanksgiving, and all my sister could talk about was the creepy guy. Our mom had not seen him yet, so she didn't take us seriously, and our dad is a skeptic, so he just thought it was some guy we kept seeing around town. After dinner, we were relaxing and watching a movie when one of our dogs started going nuts, barking at something in the backyard. This dog is a highly trained Akita that does not bark much, so the fact that she was going ballistic told us that something was out there. There is a lot of wildlife in the area like deer, coyotes, bobcats, and even moose and bears, but I have never heard that dog bark at them the way she was barking at whatever was out there that night. It took a long time to calm her down. The next morning, my sister's husband was going to take the dogs for a walk, but when he went outside, he found muddy footprints all around the back and front doors of the house. What was strange was the footprints were from someone barefoot, with no shoes, no socks. This is winter, in Maine. It's cold at this time of year, too cold to be walking around with muddy bare feet in the middle of the night. My dad decided it was best to file a police report just in case someone was planning to rob us, and when the sheriff came over, he told us that he had gotten several reports of this guy acting weird around the area for the past few days. No one had ever seen him before or knew who he was. Remember, this is a small town where everyone knows everyone, but the sheriff had not encountered him yet. My sister asked what day the report started, and it was the same day that we had first seen him. The sheriff took the report and left, and my sister and her husband decided to leave to go back home that night, but my mom and dad wanted to stay one more night to clean up and get a few things ready for when we returned for Christmas. Plus my dad wanted to make sure that the Muddy Bandit, as he was calling him, didn't return that night. The rest of the day and evening was uneventful, and we went to bed around 2 a.m. after trying to stay awake to catch the Muddy Bandit, but about an hour later I woke up to use the bathroom and get a drink of water. As I was filling my glass at the kitchen sink, something out the window caught my eye. It looked like a figure standing just behind the tree line at the edge of our property in the same scarecrow-like way that the creepy guy was standing when we first saw him. I squinted to get a better look when our dog suddenly started going nuts again, waking up my parents. My dad came running into the kitchen and I shouted, "It's him. Creepy scarecrow muddy guy." My dad grabbed his gun from its hiding place by the back door. We have the guns mainly to protect our dogs from local wildlife, and fired it into the ground outside the back door. My mom and I were each holding back our dogs, who were barking like crazy and trying to get away to chase after the figure. With all this commotion, the figure took off running through the woods just behind the tree line, and for a second, it looked like it was running in the werewolf-like way my sister's husband described, but it was out of sight in just a few seconds, so I couldn't tell, but the small trees were left swaying in its wake. It was moving that fast. My dad called the sheriff's office again, and about an hour later a deputy came by and checked the woods around our property but didn't find anything. My mom told me not to tell my sister about what happened because she wouldn't want to come back for Christmas, and my aunt was flying in from overseas, and my mom wanted us all to be together at our vacation home for the holiday. Before we left to go back home, my dad talked to our neighbor and told him what happened and asked him to keep a close eye on the house until my dad could come back and install a security system the next weekend. Later that evening, the neighbor called and said that our vacation home had caught fire, but he had noticed quickly and the fire department was already there putting it out. My dad bought a security system the next morning and drove back to the vacation home to assess the damage and install the security system. Thankfully there was minimal damage, but the fire was determined to be arson. The house was broken into, the glass in the back door was shattered, and the fire was started on an armchair in the living room using lighter fluid and a paperback book of pictures of our family my mom had made using a printing website. We had to throw away the chair, and the carpet in the living room had to be replaced, plus a fresh coat of paint and a new back door, but my dad had everything fixed up within a week. My mom was determined to have Christmas with her sister at the vacation house, so my dad watched the security cameras he had installed obsessively over the next few weeks, but only caught a few coyotes, a moose, and a bear. We thought we had seen the last of the creepy guy, aka Scarecrow Man, aka the Muddy Bandit, and all the combinations of nicknames my family has for him, but unfortunately, we had not. Now, my aunt is really into the paranormal. She even works as a tour guide at a historic, haunted attraction, but my mom still didn't want anyone outside of her, me, and my dad to know about the creepy guy, my dad firing his gun to scare the figure away in the fire. That's right, my parents kept the fire a secret from my sister and her husband. My mom told them she was redecorating the living room before the holiday and that the back door got broken in the process of redecorating. So Christmas time arrives and we are all at the vacation house, me, my parents, my sister and her husband, my aunt, her husband and 2 kids, plus my grandparents who came up from Florida. We arrived in town on the 23rd and got settled in, and the first night was uneventful. On Christmas Eve, after dinner, the whole family is sitting in the living room when there is a loud thunk at the back sliding glass door, like something hit the glass. My dad gets up to investigate and the whole family is waiting curiously to find out what it is. My mom gives me a nervous look. Finally, my dad called out, "It's a bird?" as he was confused about whether it's as a bird or not. "You're not sure?" Mom aunt called back. "It doesn't have a head," said my dad. My blood went ice cold. "Oh my God, it's the creepy guy!" My sister yelled and my mom gave her a furious look. "What creepy guy?" asked my aunt, and despite my mom's furious protests, my sister told my aunt about all the stuff that happened over Thanksgiving. I had had several drinks that night and was a little drunk, and when my sister finished her recounts of what happened, I blurted out, "But wait, there's more." My mom jumped up and immediately tried to shut the conversation down, but my sister and my aunt were not having it and coerced me to tell them all about the night before we left after Thanksgiving, my dad firing his gun, and about the fire and how it was arson, and that's why the living room was redecorated and we have the security system now. My sister was so mad at my parents for not telling her about the arson and said we were all in danger of staying there. My poor dad was cleaning up the beheaded bird the whole time this was happening and came back to a huge fight between my mom and sister while my aunt was googling demons and skinwalkers on her phone. My dad assured her that the security system he installed is so good that if a deer farts in the woods, he knows about it, and the creepy guy wasn't getting anywhere near our house again. Plus the neighbors now had a security system too, and no one had seen the creepy guy around town since the fire, so he was probably long gone. Now, my aunt and her husband on the other hand were fascinated by the whole thing. They have been trying to start making a ghost hunting channel and thought this would make great content. My mom was wholeheartedly against it, saying it would cause copycat arsons or worse, cause the creepy guy to come back. We would find out later that night that he never left. Later that evening, after their kids went to bed, my aunt and her husband took their GoPros and went out into the backyard but stayed close to the house in case there was a wild animal out there. Me, my sister and her husband watched nervously from the kitchen window. They were out there for several minutes calling out into the night, asking if there were any entities in the woods, to show themselves and say why they were there. Suddenly there was a loud guttural mba sound coming from the woods that sent my aunt and her husband running back inside the house. They played the sound back for my dad on the GoPro, but my dad wrote it off as a moose or deer mating call. I'm not an expert, but I've never heard a moose or deer that sound like that and was that loud. It was so loud that we could even hear it inside the house. The next day, after we opened presents and did the whole Christmas thing, my aunt and her husband wanted to go out and explore the woods in the daylight, so they took our dogs, and against the protests of my sister, her husband went with them armed with one of my dad's guns in case they encountered a wild animal. About an hour later they returned with a lot to tell us. About a quarter mile past the tree line directly across from our house was a campsite in the woods. They showed us footage of it on their GoPros. It was a small makeshift shelter made out of a tarp, a few bed sheets, some pallets and a collection of different patio cushions that several people around town later said were stolen from their yards. The campsite was littered with pop cans, chip bags, liquor bottles, cigarette butts, and other trash, but what was terrifying about the campsite was there was a scarecrow mounted outside the makeshift shelter made out of clothes stuffed with leaves. The head was a deflated basketball with an old, raggy, black costume wig on it. The clothes were baggy jeans and a t-shirt with the words "creepy guy" scrawled across it in permanent marker. In the video you can hear my sister's husband repeatedly saying "let's get out of here," and the dogs are acting on high alert and nervous. They poke around the campsite a little more and find a notebook with nothing in it but scribbling, no drawings, no words, just scribbles on every page. After they returned and showed us what they found, my sister wanted to leave immediately and her husband didn't argue, so they went home. My mom said that I ruined Christmas, even though my aunt was saying this was the most exciting Christmas she'd had in a decade. Later that evening we were all relaxing in the living room after dinner when we heard a loud thud on the roof and what sounded like something rolling down the roof and falling off the side of the house. We all looked at each other and my mom said, "What was that?" Right at that moment, my dad suffered a heart attack and we rushed him to the hospital. The rest of our night was spent in the waiting room of the ER. Thankfully my dad was okay and has now made a full recovery. The next morning, when we got back from the hospital, my aunt's husband walked around the house to see if he could figure out what that sound was that we all heard right before my dad had his heart attack, and on the side of the house in the bushes, he found a squirrel. With no head. We didn't tell my mom about the squirrel. She would have just gotten angry, plus, she was trying to get my dad ready to travel back home. I texted my sister about it, but she replied that she didn't want to know anything else about what happened at the vacation house. Since then, we have not been back to the house, which is unusual, but my dad has been recovering and my mom has been too stressed over my dad to want to make the trek out there, and my sister won't even talk about going out there. Although we do still have the security system out there that sends us multiple notifications a week when motion is detected on the camera. Usually it's an animal, but at least a few of those weekly notifications show nothing on the video. As for the footage that my aunt and her husband captured on their GoPros, on their way home, the airline lost their bag, and when they got it back, it had been severely water damaged, and all their GoPro footage was ruined from the whole trip. Now that my dad is pretty much recovered, my parents are planning to go to the vacation house for the 4th of July. They are still trying to talk my sister into going, but she is still really upset about them lying about the fire. A creepy stalker broke into my house. He came back. He's been at it again. I was home alone for 2 nights due to a family emergency, and honestly, all hell has broken loose. The camera we set up broke, something to do with the wires. Stepdad wasn't very happy about that. Also, bit of info about where I live. My home is surrounded by forest. It's not a big area full of loads of houses, each house is separate. There are 11 houses in my street, and this one street is surrounded by forests, and you have to walk about 15 minutes to get to the corner shops, and it takes about 45 to get to the town. It's a small area. There are a few streets, but they're all spread out with a few houses in each one. Each street is separated by big bushes and gravel paths. So, my mom and stepdad left the house on Monday at around 8, so I was left alone for the night. I was keeping myself busy by tidying up and playing on the Xbox. I noticed it was starting to rain pretty heavily, so I ran out and started to take the clothes off the washing line. As I was doing that, I noticed all the new bras I had hung up to dry were gone. My undies were gone too. I panicked, looking around knowing he had come back. I got all the clothes in and locked the doors and windows. As I did this, the letterbox made a squeaky noise. Whenever someone opens it and posts, it makes a loud squeaky noise. I stopped dead in my tracks, knowing it had to have been him. I went over to the letterbox and found a note. The note was written in scrawly handwriting and it said, "Hey G Cup, having fun? I sure am. I miss seeing you running. I miss watching your tits bouncing. Your arse looked amazing in those pink shorts last night. Can't wait to make you mine, gorgeous." I have a pic and I'll try to post it. I'm not going to lie, I sat and cried reading the note. I had worn velvet pink shorts the previous night and had gone outside into my garden to put the bins out, so he must have been watching me. I put the note down on the counter and ran around the house, locking the windows and closing blinds and curtains. I called my stepdad and explained what had happened and what was going on, and as I was talking to him I heard a big crash outside. It sounded like a bin had been tipped over. I peeked through the curtains in the living room and sure enough, one of our bins had been moved and placed right outside the window. I ended up calling the police and explained what had happened, and they said to call back if he tried to enter the house. They said unfortunately they couldn't do much due to him not doing anything wrong. They were also short-staffed at that time. My uncle is a cop in my local area, and after I rang the cops I rang him and he said the same thing. After about an hour and a half of no activity, I began to relax. I decided to order some pizza. Mama loves a bit of vegetarian pizza and garlic, and as I waited I decided to quickly run to the corner shop and get a smoothie, a few cooking things and some nibbles. As I went out I made sure I locked the door and I brought my hunting knife I had gotten from my cousin with me just in case. I got to the shops without an issue and got home fine. It's about a 30 to 35 minute walk there and back. I got inside the house, locked the door and got changed and put a plain pair of shorts and a vest top on. My pizza came and I brought my pillows and blankets down and got cozy in front of the fire and watched a few films. I'ma give credit to Jurassic Park and Predator Kazam. I love those films. Anywho, as I was sitting and watching them again I heard the letterbox open. I paused the film and went and looked at the box only to find another note in the same handwriting. It said, "Hey baby girl, love the outfit you wore today, damn G-cup, I can tell you don't need bras, you really suit dark red, hope you saved me some pizza, bet you ordered a veggie, it's your favorite right? With garlic sauce? Better save me some." I read the note and felt ill. I called the police again and they said they'd send a patrol car down, which they did, and after an hour the car left. I ended up falling asleep downstairs that night at around 11 and woke up at 9 the next day. The whole day went by incident-free. My mom and stepdad called to check on me and my uncle dropped by and gave me £60 to spend since my birthday was coming up, and that was about it. The real horror began later that night. I decided to sleep in my parents' room since they have a big ass fancy TV and I knew I had to have a RuPaul's Drag Race marathon. I got some food and drinks ready and yes, I ordered another pizza, shoot me now. I locked the house up, turned all the lights off, went into my parents' room, locked the door and started my sad marathon. About 2 hours into watching it I heard some weird noises downstairs in the kitchen area. I didn't pause the show but I did silently walk to the bedroom door and listen to see if I could hear anything else, and about 2 minutes later, creak, it was the sound of the stairs. I tried to just brush it off as house noises, but as I finished that thought, creak, I started to wonder if it was something on the stairs. I stayed quiet. I had my knife with me and my phone and I opened the messages app and made sure I could quickly text my uncle if things escalated. It's funny, but at the time I actually wasn't thinking of the stalker. I was actually thinking a burglar had broken in. The area I live in had experienced a few break-ins with the lockdown going on and the dudes doing it hadn't been caught. I stayed quiet and again, creak, there was another noise coming from the stairs. Creak, now it was getting slightly louder, which to me meant it was getting closer. Now I knew these were footsteps. I texted my uncle telling him I thought someone had broken in. He texted back saying, "Are you sure? It might just be house noises." I told him I was positive it wasn't just house noises since it repeated every 2 to 3 minutes, which I don't know about you lot, but that to me sounds like someone trying to sneak up a flight of stairs. My uncle said to keep listening and that he was on his way. I decided to turn off the TV and lights so the person didn't know which room I was in since the door had a small gap which light could be seen from. The stairs have a bend so he wouldn't have immediately seen the light and he would have to go through each room to find me. At the time I didn't think it was the stalker. I thought it was a burglar. The stalker hadn't crossed my mind. And I was worried someone was gonna steal all my stepdad's stuff. He's a tech lover and we have some expensive gym equipment. We have a tap-out punch bag. It's my brother's, which was 200 pounds. He got it for Christmas, which someone had tried to steal a year ago from our garden. My brother caught them, so we ended up letting him keep it in his room. I stayed quiet, clutching my knife, and the creaking continued up the stairs. I sat thinking to myself, if they try to get into the room, am I gonna have to fight? I had knife training. My uncle and real dad had taught me, and I knew how to fight, but in that situation, I froze up. I've been in some brutal fights and I myself have been stabbed, but I didn't know if I was gonna be able to fight what I thought was a burglar off. I didn't even know if it was just one person at the time. I thought there could have been more than one person here. As I waited for my uncle to come, I could hear the steps getting closer until they were at the top of the stairs. I was at the door waiting for the person to come and try to open it, but they didn't. They went straight towards my room, which was the very last room, the furthest away from the stairs. I know this because I could hear them walking towards it. The landing had creaky floorboards near my room, which is next to the bathroom. I got confused. I thought that any burglar would start with the first bedroom they could see and work their way to the very last one. This guy didn't. He went straight to my room. I heard the person going through my things, my wardrobe, and drawers. I heard what sounded like a bin bag rustling. You know that particular rustling noise the black bags make when you put stuff in them? That's what I could hear, just muffled. I heard the person ruffling through my drawers, and then all the noises stopped and I heard someone sigh. It was a deep sigh. Something about it sounded familiar to me. The person then went back to rummaging around, and then eventually it moved from my room to the bathroom. I heard the bag rustling again for a few seconds, then it stopped. It went quiet for a bit, then I heard something. Heavy breathing and low moaning. The dude was mumbling stuff and I could make a few words out. One word he said a few times is fuck. I started to panic a bit, wondering what was going, and then I realized why the sigh sounded familiar. It was him. The fucking stalker. He was in my house. I just knew it was him, and then I started to connect the dots. He went to my room first because that was his true intention in the first place. The rummaging around was him taking my clothes, my bras, panties, anything else he likes. That was why he had a bag. And then I stopped in shock and realized what he was doing, what the heavy breathing and moaning was. I felt sick, I felt so sick. He was taking my things to play with his bloody meat rod. I messaged my uncle again, telling him and asking him where he was, and he said he was on his way, but that it was gonna take about 30 minutes due to a breakdown. Typical, I thought to myself. I then realized the noises had stopped. I put my phone down and moved very slowly and quietly to the far corner of the room and sat down. I couldn't hear anything, absolutely nothing. Then it happened. I know you can hear me, I know you know it's me, Jesse. He spoke so loudly and with so much authority and confidence, it was so creepy. Shit, I'm fucked. Was all I could think of. I also know something about you that no one else knows, he said. So much cockiness was dripping off his voice, it was sickening. What the fuck is he on about? I thought to myself. I was silently crying at this point. I know you're probably thinking, Jesse, WTF is he cracking on about? I've been watching you a while now, babe. I know you have it so well. I know what you love and what you hate. I know everything. He said in a sort of low yell, I guess. This is burned into my memory. I don't think I'll ever forget it, and the worst part, the part that made me physically sick, is this next bit. I'm getting impatient now, Jess. I'm fucking sick of chasing you about and you playing hard to get. He shouted, but not super loud. He was getting closer to my parents' bedroom now. Bet you're wondering why I've come now, why I've picked this particular time to come. Well, I'll tell you. To put it simply, I know your period's ended and I know this is around the best time for you to get pregnant. Had I been able to see him, I bet my life he would have been smirking. The way he said it made me ill. He sounded so arrogant, it was mad. I was stunned, fucking stunned. I threw up everywhere, not due to shock but due to the fact he was right. I know it sounds ridiculous, trust me I do, but he was fucking right. I have an app that tracks my periods and it also tells you when you are ovulating. At that time I was, and it really was the best time for me to get pregnant. I felt fucking disgusted and so violated. I wanted to know how the hell he knew this, so I did something stupid. I shouted to him and asked him how he knew this, and this is exactly what he said to me. Jess is not thick. I told you I know you and I know your habits. I know when you start your periods. I know everything, Jesse. When you're on the rag you always go out to the town and buy tampons, and you always end up buying face masks and fruit and veg. You always go to Asda to do it. I told you I'd be watching you. You didn't believe me, did you? You always empty your bin out after your periods end as well. Since you put them in the red bin in your room. You empty it once they've ended. I watched you do this, I kept track of you doing this and marked it on my phone. See? I do fucking pay attention, I do fucking care and love you. I'm not like the horrible pricks you've been with in the past. I pay attention. He was getting angry and he was banging on the door. I was crying out loud now. I felt sick. I was terrified and shocked someone was sick enough in the head to do this, to go this far. I messaged my uncle telling him what the stalker said and what was happening, and he said he was about 15 minutes away and to stay in the room. The stalker guy started to bang louder on the door, demanding I open it, saying stuff like, "We're gonna make beautiful babies, babes." I was terrified. I had no clue what was gonna happen. I just sat and cried, asking him why me. What had I done? You ain't done anything. I just want you. He said this in such a calm and cold manner it gave me goosebumps. That was the only response I got. After that all he said was gross things about my body. God, those tits are so big and juicy, or I'm a tap that thick ass Jesse, just watch, or I'm gonna fuck you raw. I want you to have my kid's baby, I need you. He even admitted to wanking over me, and he said the pictures he has didn't do justice. The whole time he was saying this he was kicking the door. The door started to chip at the bottom. At this point, I was screaming and crying and begging him to go, to just leave me alone. I shouted and told him I was just 18 and I didn't want kids. I said I was young and that I didn't want to go through this or have kids. That didn't work, it only made him more excited. My uncle texted me saying he was on his way still, but he was stuck, and said another officer was coming down but that he'd be about 20 minutes. I was so angry and scared I was in the middle of texting him back asking why he was stuck and what he meant when I stopped and noticed something. Stalker had stopped pounding on the door. It had gone silent. I gathered up the courage to walk towards the door and I put my ear against it, and nothing. It was silent. I waited for another minute and still no noise. I decided to unlock the bedroom door and slowly open it to see if he had gone. I opened it very slowly and I couldn't see him or hear anything, so I stepped out of the room and slowly made my way to my room. He wasn't in there, but my room was a mess. He had gone through my wardrobe and drawers like I said and had taken all my bras and undies out of my drawers. I felt sick but pushed on. I walked out of my room and looked into the bathroom. But the bag wasn't there. I had expected to find the bag with my things in it, but no, it had gone. I left the bathroom and started to walk down the stairs, and yes, it creaked, and with each creaking noise I cringed and I kept thinking he was gonna hear me and come running at me. He didn't know. I got down the stairs and slowly walked towards the kitchen and no one was there. I looked into the living room and to my horror he was sitting there, on the couch, elbows on knees, his head down, just sitting. I gasped quietly, but it was loud enough for him to have heard. His head shot up and I could see he was staring at me. The living room curtains were open and so was the living room window. I had shut it. I knew I had shut it. He looked me up and down and stood up and started to slowly walk towards me, and I started backing off as he got closer. I ended up backing into a wall like a bloody idiot, and he stopped right in front of me and just stared at me. He put his hand on my cheek, which is when I noticed he was wearing gloves, leather gloves, or at least I think it was leather. He looked at me, then looked down at my chest. I was crying, not knowing what to do or say. I have never ever felt true fucking fear this intense before, and I don't think I ever will again. His eyes in the dark no longer looked beautiful to me. They looked like black pits. His long black hair wasn't tied up like it usually was. It was flowing down past his shoulders. He wore all black like usual. He had his hood up. And he was staring at me so intensely. I couldn't move. I was so scared. I know you all probably think I'm an idiot for not shouting or screaming or attacking him, but honestly at that moment I was too scared to move. I couldn't move or speak. His hand went from my cheek down to my neck. He was tracing my neck and was surprisingly gentle. He then got to my boobs. He put both hands on them and was gently squeezing them. So juicy, so soft, fuck. I didn't have a bra on since I don't wear them for bed. He muttered this under his breath. He ended up moving his hands onto my hips. He was so much taller than me and I could just tell he was strong. I finally found my voice and said, "The cops are gonna be here soon. If you kill me they'll catch you." God, I must have sounded like a terrified little kid. He looked at me, sighed, and said, "I wasn't gonna hurt you, Jess. The only moans and screams that would come from me touching you will be when I'm shagging you, babe." He took a deep breath, put his fingers under my chin, lifting my head up, and continued, "But if you feel that scared, I guess I can wait. But don't make us wait too long, babe, cause the longer I wait the rougher I'll be." He then let go of me, walked back towards the couch. He picked up a black plastic bag, presumably with my bras and undies still in, and he threw it out of the window. The cops think that's how he got in. They think he managed to open it and climbed in, and climbed out himself. He took a few steps and turned back and said, "I love you and I will be back," and with that, he took off running with the bag. He ran and I couldn't see him anymore. I stayed standing there looking out the window for what felt like forever, but it could have only been a few minutes. I shook myself out of the trance I was in and ran to the window trying to see if I could spot him, but I couldn't, so I closed and locked the window and pulled the curtains back. I had left my phone upstairs and decided to run back up and get it. My uncle had been texting me and trying to get in touch. I had a few missed calls from my mom, stepdad and cousin. I was in the middle of texting when I heard sirens. The cops. I was so happy I actually started to cry again. I ran down the stairs. The cops came in and a few minutes later my uncle showed up. I told them everything and that it took statement down and started to look around the house, but there wasn't much physical evidence or anything that could help. The only thing they took interest in was the window in my room. My mom and stepdad came home and we went to my nana's for the night while the house was cleaned and searched. I'm back home now and the police are still investigating. The police patrol the area I live in a lot more now due to the risks of him coming back and the fact he could potentially try and rape me. I'm talking to an online therapist due to what's happened. I don't sleep much anymore and I don't eat. I get flashbacks and panic attacks a lot now. My parents are looking for somewhere else to live now and we're even considering moving to a completely different area in England together now. The work stalker. A few years back, I had this really creepy experience with an older coworker of mine that still kind of shakes me to this day. It happened at this place that I'd been working at for a couple of years at that point. The place was a small factory of sorts, with less than a handful of employees, including myself. One day though, my boss introduced us to this new, older guy that he'd brought in to start working in the other, newer side of the factory. You see, the factory where he worked had two different sides to it. One side is for beeswax and one side is for wood production. My boss had brought him in because they went to church together and the wood production on the other side had a religious significance. The new, older coworker worked there with us for about 1 month before he approached me one day and introduced himself to me. He seemed like a nice guy and even came back to give me a Hershey kiss not long after that. A couple of months later, I got asked by our boss if I could go pick up my new older coworker, probably because his car had broken down or something. I agreed to it, so my boss asked me if it was okay to give the coworker my phone number so that we could coordinate via text. I said it was fine and went on my way. I brought him back to the factory with no problems. Soon after that though, I started to get random and sporadic texts from him late at night. At first, the texts were just about us maybe hanging out soon, while simultaneously apologizing to me because he knew he was much older than I, but then the texts started to get pretty pervy and they would be as long as a mini book. The texts were just long, misspelled random, pervy compilations. I tried to just ignore the texts, but that only made them start coming more frequently. In the midst of all this one day, my roommates were scrounging for a ride to a casino only a few miles from our house. I gave them a few dollars for a ride and they said that they'd find their own ride back. So imagine my surprise, when they returned only a couple hours later with their own ride all right. Their ride was my creepy coworker. Not only was I creeped the hell out that this pervy jerk now knew where I lived, but I also didn't know how he came to give my roommates that ride. Was it just sheer coincidence or something more? A few days after that, I went to visit a friend at his apartment that was located on our main street running through our small, historic downtown area. When I came downstairs from his apartment, as he was located on the second floor, I made my usual turn, walking on the sidewalk in front of all the main street shops. As I walked past one of the shops that was maybe 2 doors down from my friend's apartment, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but it couldn't be, could it? To my great dismay, it was him, my creepy-ass older coworker standing in the doorway of one of the shops and smiling creepily at me from under a black top hat. A couple of weeks after that little incident, I noticed him again as I left my friend's apartment. He was just standing on the sidewalk with that same creepy grin plastered on his gaunt face. Since I had already informed my friend after the last incident, I simply texted him real quick to let him know the creep was back. I got into my car and left after sending the text, so I didn't find out until later that the creepy coworker was gone by the time my friend got downstairs to the sidewalk. At that point though, the texts were still coming even faster than before. He was even threatening to come by my house if I didn't respond. Long, provocative texts dictating what he'd like to have happened between us if he did just happen to show up at my house. When I would see him during the day at work though, he would act as though everything were normal, giving no hint of his nighttime persona. After seeing him yet again as I left my friend's apartment, I just so happened to overhear a couple of coworkers of mine standing around discussing how weird our new, older coworker was. Right then, I stepped in and joined the convo, finally showing one of my other coworkers the text messages that the creep had been sending me. I had been working with that particular coworker for a few years, but I didn't know him too well. He was one of those people who came off kind of grumpy and distant. Still, I told him and my other coworker not to say anything. They both nodded in agreement and we went our separate ways to finish up for the day. When I came into work the next day though, my boss immediately called me into his office. My boss told me that he'd been informed of the situation and the texts and he wanted to see my phone to read them. I told my boss that I didn't really want to get anyone in trouble, but he said that was beside the point and that my situation needed to be addressed. My boss also stated that my older coworker had no right or reason to be texting me and talking to me the way he was talking to me. The boss must have had a pretty good talk with him because all the crap stopped from the older coworker after that. The other grumpy coworker of mine apologized to me for saying something to the boss, but I completely understood and I was actually pretty grateful to him for that. I should have been the one to take the initiative to talk to the boss about it, but I was just too chicken. Fortunately, though, that situation seemed to work out for all involved, because life went on as usual and everyone involved acted as though nothing had ever happened. Well, I can't really say that because that situation actually caused the grumpy coworker and me to talk more and we started dating. We were together for about 3 years and then we got married. So creepy old coworker, let's not ever meet again, or I think my husband will certainly have something to say about it. Shadow Stalker Unmasked. Detective Sarah Collins sat alone in her dimly lit office, staring at the files scattered across her desk. The case of the Shadow Stalker had consumed her for months, leaving her exhausted and haunted by the gruesome crimes. The city was paralyzed with fear as the unknown killer continued to claim innocent lives, leaving behind nothing but a chilling calling card, a black rose. As Sarah combed through the evidence once again, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, sending a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the clock. It was nearing midnight. Reluctantly, she decided to call it a night, hoping that a fresh perspective in the morning would bring her closer to catching the elusive murderer. Just as she reached for her coat, the phone on her desk rang ominously, startling her. She hesitated before answering, knowing that this call could be the break she had been waiting for. "Detective Collins," she answered, her voice filled with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. A distorted voice on the other end whispered, "The Shadow Stalker strikes tonight. You have until dawn to save them." Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make sense of the cryptic message. Who was this caller? Did they know something about the killer? Determined not to let fear overcome her, Sarah quickly gathered her things and rushed to the address the voice had provided. As she arrived at the location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a heavy fog blanketed the area, further obscuring her path. The atmosphere was eerily silent, broken only by the distant hooting of an owl. Sarah tightened her grip on her gun and cautiously entered the derelict building. The faint glow of a single light bulb illuminated the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. As she ventured deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, she stumbled upon a macabre sight. A lifeless body, bearing the unmistakable signature of the Shadow Stalker, lay sprawled before her, blood pooling around it. The killer had struck again. Sarah's mind raced with a mix of determination and fear. She knew time was running out. She had to find the killer and end this nightmare once and for all. She pressed on, following the trail of black roses left as a cruel taunt. As she descended into the heart of the warehouse, the air grew colder, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The sound of her footsteps echoed ominously, intensifying the sense of dread that consumed her. Suddenly, a trapdoor creaked open beneath her, and Sarah plummeted into darkness. Pain shot through her leg as she landed on a hard, unforgiving surface. The fall had incapacitated her. leaving her vulnerable to the very predator she sought to apprehend. Frantically, Sarah reached for her flashlight and cast its beam across the room. Her blood turned to ice as she realized the truth: she had fallen into the lair of the Shadow Stalker. The walls were adorned with disturbing photographs of his victims, their terrified faces etched into her memory forever. In the distance, a low, sinister chuckle resonated through the chamber. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in darkness, wielding a gleaming knife, a grotesque embodiment of evil. The killer's eyes glowed with sadistic pleasure as he approached Sarah, relishing in the fear that emanated from her. But Sarah refused to succumb to terror. Summoning every ounce of courage, she reached for her gun and fired, the bullet finding its mark. The Shadow Stalker staggered backward, a look of shock and disbelief on his face, before collapsing to the ground. Breathing heavily, Sarah knew that the nightmare was finally over.